Welcome to Common Sense Unfiltered, where we talk common sense. Because as it turns out, it's not all that common.
I'm Katie Ratlief, Executive Director of Common Sense Institute, Arizona.
I'm Kelly Caufield, Executive Director of Common Sense Institute, Colorado.
And I'm Cinamon Watson, National CEO of Common Sense Institute.
Across the country, policymakers are making big decisions on complex issues that are often filtered through politics and partisanship. That's where CSI comes in.
We're nonpartisan, nonprofit, and focused on the facts. And each episode, we bring in the experts behind the research to break down complex issues and what they actually mean for your business, household, and family.
This is Common Sense Unfiltered, where common sense still exists, even when it's hard to find. Hello, and welcome to CSI Unfiltered. We're really excited to bring this episode to you because it's our very first episode of CSI Unfiltered. And what better way to launch this new chapter than with a deep dive into homelessness, one of the most visible, complex, and just tough issues facing our nation today. I'm joined as always by Kelly Caufield, Executive Director of CSI Colorado, Katie Ratlief, Executive Director of CSI Arizona, and Dustin Zvonek, our homelessness fellow at CSI.
I'm really excited about this conversation today because, as our research has shown, this is an issue that Colorado has had to face head on. Over the last several years, homelessness has grown rapidly and the spending has increased just along with it. Services have expanded and more beds have become available. That disconnect is what really pushed Common Sense to take a harder look at what's actually driving the problem.
We've seen a very similar trend in Arizona. We've consistently ranked near the top of the national rankings in terms of our growing homeless population. And especially in Pima County, we just have a massive imbalance in terms of the number of people who are living unsheltered on the streets versus sheltered homeless individuals who are at least able to get access to some services. And so what we're really seeing is this indicates that it's not just a housing supply issue, but it's time to sort of address the broader policy issues that are shaping this on the ground.
And that brings us to our guest today, Dustin Zvonek. He's a homelessness fellow with CSI, and we're thrilled to have him with us. He is a former Aurora City Council member and Mayor Pro Tem, and lead author of CSI's most recent work on homelessness. Dustin has studied this issue in models across the country, from housing first to work first, and he brings a particular expertise in this area. So welcome to you, Dustin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Dustin, before we get into models and solutions, help us level set. What are we actually looking at today in terms of homelessness?
Yeah, so I think it's important to start with the data, and I want to cover a couple of key facts. So in 2024, more than 762,000 people experienced homelessness in the United States. Roughly 270,000 of those were unsheltered, and 22% of the homeless population is chronically homeless. About 18% are severely mentally ill, and about 15% struggle with chronic substance abuse. So the data tells us what, frankly, people are seeing in real life, right? Whether you're in Arizona, Colorado, or California, lots of states and big cities across the country are seeing homelessness on the rise. And the impact of it is significant. You're seeing increased levels of crime. It's impacting businesses. More and more money is being directed towards trying to address this issue. But unfortunately, because of the models, and I know we're going to get into that later, what we've seen is the numbers are continuing to grow despite the fact that more money is being poured into it. And that's coming as a direct result of the fact that people are seeing this problem. The numbers tell the story, but I don't think regular people need to hear the data to understand that this is a real and growing problem.
Well, Dustin, you really touched on something that we like to talk about here at CSI, which is data can tell a story. We have to start with the facts and the numbers. I think it's extraordinary. One data point that you shared, the number of people experiencing homelessness nationally, that exceeds the population of the state of Wyoming by about 30%. That's just an incredible number.
And for me, Dustin, it's really raising the question of why are we spending so much money and yet we're seeing the homeless population not go down, but it's actually growing. So I think going back to one of the distinctions that you just made around the different homelessness cohorts, I think the one of the missing pieces of the puzzle for many homelessness policies is, this conversation around it's just about housing. For years, the conversation has been homelessness is a result of out of reach housing costs that we're seeing in some of our most expensive states and cities. But when Common Sense Institute looked at the data across all 50 states, our analysis found nationally and in Colorado specifically, housing affordability wasn't always the strongest correlation found. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, when I was on council and had an opportunity to learn more about the challenges related to homelessness, I think um, one of the bigger challenges to actually addressing it is that people want to simplify it. They want to make it just about housing. They say, look, if people just had housing, they wouldn't be homeless, right? I mean, and I guess intuitively that makes sense. If you give somebody a home, they're no longer homeless. But they are unhoused or they're experiencing homelessness, however you want to say it, for different reasons. Some of them, it is because of tough economic conditions. There's another segment of the population that is just, that has such significant mental health challenges that they don't have family to support them. So they're going to either be on our streets or in our prisons. And then you have people with chronic substance abuse issues, right? And so there are a bunch of different reasons that people are experiencing homelessness. And so when you try to solve a really multifaceted challenge with one solution, you get what we're seeing, which is, we're not seeing actual results in terms of fewer people experiencing homelessness. And that's where I think that the model and the opportunity to change the model is going to be necessary if we want to see the numbers go down with increased, investment into this challenge.
Justin, another data point from your research that I found really interesting is just how geographically compact the issue is. You found that 3/4 of the nation's homeless population live in just 11 states. And so California, of course, alone accounts for about a total or a quarter of the total homeless population in the United States. What does that tell us? What can we draw from that about the impact of state level policy decisions on this issue?
State policy level decisions are incredibly impactful, local decisions as well. I mean, and I think the ones that you really want to drive in and understand is when you have states that are creating more permissive laws around drug use, when you're creating more permissive laws around things like petty theft, those tend to be the states where you see the biggest increase and where you have the biggest challenges. Because in order, people often say with retail theft, you've seen over the years in a lot of these states that are seeing an increase in homelessness, a decrease in the penalties related to retail theft. And they say these are people that are trying to, they're trying to provide for their family. And the reality is that in the homeless population, people are attracted to these types of policies because they're not trying to steal to feed their family. They're stealing and taking advantages of these permissive laws to feed their addictions. And so state policy, local policy has an incredible impact on the number of people experiencing homelessness in their community.
Thanks, Dustin. I would just add that Colorado, where I sit, is a clear example of how state level policy choices have an outsized impact on these national trends. Between 2020 and 2024, a report found that Colorado's homeless population grew by roughly 90%. That is the fourth fastest growth rate in the nation. When we looked at the data and we unpacked it in a few different ways, we found that Colorado ranks ninth nationally in total homelessness per capita. We are seventh in chronic homelessness. We are seventh in severely mentally ill homelessness, to the point you were just sharing, as well as highest, in the top 10 of homelessness with chronic substance abuse issues, and 10th in unsheltered homelessness. So a lot of really challenging statistics here for the state of Colorado. And I think when we zoom in even more closely on Denver, you can see it even more clearly. I live here in Denver, and the data showed that in 2024, the Denver metro area counted over 9,900 unhoused individuals, which is a number of our reports went really deep on the Denver data because this has been a real priority for the city. That through the All In Mile High program, we found that over 2,200 individuals were served. And the average cost was just extraordinary. That cost exceeded $69,000 per participant, with about 27% returning to unsheltered homelessness after exit. And roughly $16 million was spent on individuals who ultimately remained unsheltered. So at some point, you just really have to ask whether success is being measured as placement or stability. And I think it just brings us to one of the most debated and misunderstood policy questions, Dustin, that I know you've really wrestled with. And that is, when it comes to homelessness, what's working better? Is it a housing first strategy or is it a work first?
That's a great question. And that to me is at the heart of the debate that we need to be having. And so, housing first, where it succeeds is in the appearance of addressing homelessness. So, and I'll use Denver as an example. The mayor of Denver has aggressively pursued a housing first strategy where he's taking people who are on the streets, are there, all around the city, impacting businesses. He is hearing a lot and has heard a lot from the business community about how the homeless population is impacting the 16th Street Mall and areas where people don't want to go. And so by pursuing housing first, where you're just taking those people and moving them into housing, from a perception standpoint, he is addressing homelessness, right? So if you're a business owner or somebody who works downtown, you think, hey, this is working. But where it falls short, where housing first falls short, is when it comes to actually helping those individuals move from being unhoused towards a path to self-sufficiency, which is ultimately the real metric we should be measuring. It's not, this isn't a game of hide the homeless so that the public doesn't see them. Are we helping people move from where they are to a place of self-sufficiency? And with housing first, there are no prerequisites or frankly, any expectations at any point that you participate in services that will help you to achieve self-sufficiency, whether that be workforce development to help get a job or to, participate in addiction and recovery treatment that will help you to kick that chronic addiction to, again, you want to help people. That's really what serving and addressing homelessness should be about is helping people to improve their situation, not just to put a roof over their head. And so, housing first can give the perception of success, but ultimately it's falling short of actually helping treat the reasons for homelessness. And I would say this, that we talked about the population of the individuals who are so significantly mentally ill that they are never going to be self-sufficient. They don't have family to help. These are the individuals who at one point in time in our country's history would have been in institutions, but that isn't the policy. And I think that there is a more humane way. You think about the way we care for elderly, some sort of an assisted living type of arrangement for that population. But that population isn't the majority, right? It has to be treated different. So this goes back to what I said at the very beginning. When you try to simplify homelessness into one type of problem, you stop thinking creatively about the different types of solutions. So housing first might be an answer for a segment of the population, but it's not going to work for the people who have chronic addiction issues. It's not going to help for the people who just need help on the workforce development side. And so that's where a treatment first or a work first mentality, where you still are getting people off the streets. And technically, I guess you're still housing first because you're providing that shelter. But then there is expectations that you participate in services. There is an expectation that you're taking your individual path or journey towards self-sufficiency. And so, my hope would be that there is a more, kind of a broader approach to different strategies to solving homelessness. And to me, that's where work and treatment first, what they allow for, as opposed to housing first, which is pretty rigid in the fact that it's provide housing, allow wraparound services to be made available, but don't require them or expect them to participate in order as a condition to stay in the housing.
I was just going to add, this is why the work that you do and the work that Common Sense Institute does is so important. It's a well-intended policy, but the data simply shows that it's not working. You cited and Kelly shared some of the data from Denver and Colorado. We've seen the same pattern nationally. Between 2020 and 2024, Los Angeles saw their homelessness population grow by approximately 39%. San Francisco increased by about 9%. And shockingly, Portland increased by about 70%. All of those cities are strong proponents of housing first.
Thanks, Katie. I also want to talk about some of the successes that we're seeing, at least here in Colorado, would lift up Colorado Springs. They've taken on a bit more of a hybrid approach where they are working with a number of shelters that have more of a treatment oriented model. And they're seeing a different story than what we're seeing in Denver. They've seen declines in total homelessness. I think it declined, 12% from 2023 to 2024. And their unsheltered homelessness has also dropped. That's dropped by nearly 31%. So the city is seeing some results that are encouraging.
Yeah. And we're doing some of this work in other states outside of Colorado and Arizona. We're currently working on through our National Policy Center on Crime and Public Safety. We're looking at the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, what has happened to their homelessness population. And it's the same trends that we've been discussing that are being seen in cities and around the country and also nationally at an aggregate level. The number of homeless individuals is increasing, the funding is increasing, but that increased funding is really having no effect. And so the takeaway wasn't that the effort or the funding is lacking, but that the system is fragmented. Resources are not aligned, as you said, Dustin, with the actual needs of the population. And our findings suggested that smaller, more disciplined systems could have a greater impact than larger, sort of less structured ones. So Dustin, why do structure and expectations matter so much? You touched on it a little, but elaborate a little more.
Yeah. So Katie, you're exactly right. The structure and expectations are important. And I'll give you an example. Kelly mentioned Colorado Springs, right? And it's a great example of kind of a hybrid approach that they've taken if have seen success. But the one that I point to, even that I believe has had even more success in terms of actually impacting people's lives, is Step Denver. It's a smaller program in Denver. They don't take any federal funding because they don't want to compromise the rigid expectations that they place. And look, Step Denver won't work for that entire population, the homeless population. It just won't. But for those that go through it, the success rate is incredible. And so, having expectations around addiction and recovery, addressing your mental health issues, actually doing things to help build the skills you need to get back into the workforce, helping people with expectations, having a little carrot and stick, it's proven to work. When you just put somebody who is, use the example of somebody who has a severe addiction issue or challenge, and you put them into housing and you say, hey, look, there's some services available if you want to. Are we surprised when they don't participate? Are we surprised when they don't actually do the things necessary to kick the habits? I mean, this is, we've seen this fail in so many cities, but when you do apply those expectations, when you do have requirements for sobriety, the programs that do that have shown success. And I think what you said at the end there, that the smaller, more disciplined systems have outperformed larger ones, I think that's exactly right. And this is where one of the arguments that has been made is that the federal government through HUD should start to allow, instead of having a housing first priority or policy preference, they should allow local governments, cities and states to be the laboratories of democracy that they were set up to be, allow for these smaller, more structured programs to work. And there are different segments of the population to work with, but I think that you would see more success and therefore fewer people experiencing homelessness.
One of the strongest themes in your research and your recent op-ed, Dustin, was federal homelessness policy has often followed ideology instead of outcomes. First off, I want to let listeners know that we will link that op-ed because it was so succinct and so compelling on this issue. But can you tell us, how did Housing First become so dominant in federal funding?
Yep. It's a relic of the Obama administration. So around the 2010 timeframe, it became the official preference of the federal government. And the impact has been significant. And one of the examples I often give is that it essentially just said, hey, listen, if you're an organization out there that has transitional housing, which is not what they like permanent supportive housing. So those are two common terms you hear. But if you had transitional housing where there were expectations and requirements, if you dropped those requirements and just made them available, and now your transitional housing became a supportive housing, it would then be eligible for federal funding. The cynic in me believes that there was a larger effort to try to create more subsidized housing, and this was a quick way to do it. I hope that's that maybe I've been around government too long and, have a jaded view of that. But it seems like there's no other reason to do it, because if the goal is, again, to take people who are experiencing homelessness and move them towards self-sufficiency, that having expectation and requirements are necessary, and just dropping them. And that's an example. I visited the Haven for Hope in San Antonio, and they're a perfect example of what transpired when they started. They were a treatment first facility. They were very similar to the structure of the navigation campus that we started in Aurora, where you had the emergency shelter, you had transitional housing, there was expectations that you participated in services in order to stay there. Everybody's journey was different. When the federal government said, hey, look, in order to continue to receive federal funding, you have to be housing first. So when they didn't initially do that, all of the people that were in their facility were still counted as unhoused, because anybody who was in not a housing first, facility, essentially a permanent supportive housing, was considered unhoused. Once they dropped the requirements, now they're housed. Same people, same buildings, same facilities. The difference was dropping the requirements. And so it has been a policy that's been on the books for, 20 plus years. And I know that, President Trump's executive order is trying to unwind it. Unfortunately, it's tied up in the courts, which has tied up HUD funding for any and all programs associated with homelessness this year. My hope is that Congress will actually take action and get rid of the preference towards a single model that is trying to address a very multifaceted problem.
Thanks, Dustin. What I'm hearing from you is that these priorities in federal policy is really what states and policymakers should be focused on. It's these policy priorities rather than what is the funding level and is that going up?
Yeah. So I think what you're saying, Dustin, is if success is defined as people housed tonight, you'll design one system. Whereas if it's defined as people who are stable 6 or 12 months down the line, the states and nonprofits and providers will design a totally different system.
That's exactly right. I mean, there's a saying, right, in business that what gets measured gets done, or what gets measured gets done. And so if the measurement is how many people are off the streets and in housing, then just build a bunch of buildings, right? You get people off. But if the metric is, we want to know how many people have gone from being unhoused, whether it's the side of the road or sleeping in their car or in a shelter, to becoming self-sufficient, you'll design a different system, because the metrics would be different. And that's one of the biggest changes that needs to be made from a policy standpoint, is like, how are we measuring success? And I sympathize with the business owners who, for them, it's like, hey, look, I just want people not in front of my business because it leads to all sorts of problems. So I get that. I sympathize with them. But there's also the very real human element of, are we addressing these individuals in a way? Are we helping them to become self-sufficient, which is what we should be aiming to do?
And that's the takeaway. Homelessness policy hasn't failed because people don't care. It's failed because we've been reluctant to adjust when the data that tells us our assumptions are incomplete. Dustin, if policymakers could change one thing to improve homelessness tomorrow, what should it be?
It should be that there's not a one size fits all solution. This is truly a complex challenge, and it requires, a different type of thinking. So that would be the one big takeaway: is one size fits all doesn't work.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for
Thanks,
having me.
Dustin.
I appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening to us, and we'll see you next time on Common Sense Unfiltered.